Welcome to the GBC Big 3 podcast, a weekly podcast where we sit down and unpack 3 big questions raised from our Sunday sermon. I'm your host, Matt Willis, and joining me as co-host this week in what I can only describe as the pinnacle of a winter cardi is the always delightful Mark Coleman. Mark, where have you been? What are you doing? Tell me something about your life.
Enjoying appropriately catching up with a few good friends now. So we hung out with some friends at the weekend and I enjoyed a little bit of travel and a roast dinner in someone else's home.
Oh, nice. Yeah. But you know what has stirred up in me in this whole restrictions are starting to ease is the awkward do we hug? Do we not hug? Do we shake hands? My father-in-law actually totally shut me down yesterday. I went into their house and went to shake his hand and he just shook his head at me. Didn't even say anything, just moved his hand away. And I was just I don't know. It's creating in me such social anxiety. I'm not going to lie.
Well, we've got to be socially distant.
I know, but I'm so needy. It's hard.
It's hard.
It is so hard. Oh gosh, reading the room. It's a skill. It is such a skill. And joining us also in the preacher's chair this week is Roxanne Lawler. Now, Roxy, you kind of turned tables on Sunday and turned the sermon into a bit of a Q&A session. What inspired this change of events?
A Q&A with myself.
Yeah. I loved it. It was great.
Yeah, I was thinking about the topic was just so meaty, right? It was full on. I love how they give the random kids person the most.
Hey, he's 38 verses.
Yeah. Here you go.
Do something
work that out. Yeah, throw a puppet in there if you can.
Yeah.
So I figured a great way to do that is just to unpack it a little bit and ask questions that I thought maybe you would ask when you were coming to that passage for the first time. So just wanted to make it easy for people to slide in and to get some understanding around that. And so I think it worked. And also because we're doing things online, Matt, I just didn't want to stand there and yabber on. I wanted to change it up a bit visually as well.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah,
I loved it. Like I said, it was great stuff.
Yeah.
Now, this week, Roxanne spoke on the power of an indestructible life as part of our series in the book of Hebrews titled Anchor. And you can listen to that message again through our regular GBC Sermons podcast. But today, as always, we'll be unpacking 3 big questions submitted through Slido during our Sunday services. So guys, let's get into the big 3. Now, as we lead into question 1, I've got to start with a bit of a confession. When it comes to my spiritual practice of opening up scriptures, I've kind of let the Old Testament stay where the Old Testament lies. You know, when it comes to, the temple and the sacrificial system and this whole idea of the Levitical priesthood, I'm kind of well, Jesus came and kind of turned everything on its head. So a little bit why bother? I don't really need to know that too much. And then we come to a passage like what you unpacked for us on Sunday Rocks in Hebrews. And the author is just using that Old Testament imagery and language to put Jesus in context, kind of point at who he is and what his role is. And all of a sudden, my lack of understanding of that Old Testament tradition kind of shines even brighter because it makes it hard for me to fully grasp then, what is the author trying to say about Jesus? And one of those, Old Testament ideas that really came forward is this idea of the priesthood and the line of Levites that, out of the 12 tribes of Israel, it was the Levites who the priesthood stemmed out of. And I thought it would be really helpful. We had a number of people kind of ask about, what does this mean? Why is this important? Why do I care? And that's ultimately exactly what question number 1 is. What is the significance of the Levitical lineage within the Old Testament when it comes to the priesthood? So Rox, I'll start with you first.
Yeah, thanks for that great big question.
Yeah, just casually. Hey.
Just casually, yeah. Look, I think just to your first point about the significance of the Old Testament, I just want to dig into that just for a second. Yeah. I love how Messianic Jews, which are Jews who believe in Jesus, they don't call it the Old Testament. They actually call it the First Testament. And it's just to reframe that it's actually so foundational. Everything in the new is built on the first, right?
Yeah.
So there is value. Let me encourage whoever's listening, and yourself and me, preach to myself here, to dig into the First Testament because it is really, the foundation of what we know from Jesus, and you can see this in this passage about the Levites, right? So as you are probably aware, there was 12 tribes of Israel, and God had promised the nation of Israel this promised land, and they were going to take this land. And it's we've preached through Joshua, which was the Israelites going into the land and settling, and finally they were taking up the promise of God. And these 12 tribes were released into the land, but one of the tribes was the Levites, and they were not given an allotment of land in the same way that the other 11 tribes were. The whole other 11 tribes, they portioned out, little sections, and they got to farm and to grow, but the Levites didn't get that. They were given instead a task, a role, and they were to be the tribe that was going to intercede between Israel and God. They had to look after the tabernacle and later on the temple. They had to offer all the sacrifices. And God actually says that for the Levites, the Lord himself is their inheritance. So instead of getting land, they get God, and they get this relationship with God. And so I guess in the people of Israel, the Levitical tribe, the Levites, had this really special role, this intimacy with God, this responsibility of showing to the rest of the people how to have a relationship with God, how to get close to God. And so I guess they were kind of like, Mark often talks about the idea of the show home. I don't know if you've ever heard him preach on this, when you go to those houses in the estates and you look around and you think, I could live here. And he talks about how Israel in the Old Testament was a bit like a show home for the rest of the world. Like, here's how you're meant to live in obedience and relationship with God. You might have heard him preach on that kind of thing before. Well, the Levites were a bit like a show home for the rest of Israel. Right. So just like Israel was a show home, a demonstration of the rest of the world, the Levites were a show home for the rest of Israel. This is how you live. This is how you intercede. This is how you be at one with God. So I find that kind of interesting. But for me, I think it's interesting and it's great to know, and it points us to Jesus. But for me, the bigger question is, what does that mean for us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yay, the Levites.
That's awesome. They had this. I'm not a Levite.
Exactly. and Jesus has kind of superseded that anyway. He's in a different order, as we heard on Sunday, the order of Melchizedek, right?
Hence my why bother comment
hence your
before.
Why bother. And so there's this great passage in 1 Peter that we go on to read in. It's like 1 Peter chapter 2. Verse 9, and it says this about us as Christians, us as believers. And it says, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possessions, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. And that language there of us as Christians being this royal priesthood, that we're going to be the same show home, the same demonstration for the world, like we are the ones now who mediate. So we're not kind of Levites, but we do that same functional role. We are the ones who take that on and who mediate and tell the world, this Jesus, this is how you become friends with God.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's great.
Yeah, that is
stuff.
awesome.
Yeah, it's
great stuff. Common, what do you have to throw in on this theological
a small nugget? I just kind of harking back to the question about Levi, the tribe of Levi, and and really not heaps more to add than Rox has kind of described, but just there's some discussion amongst kind of scholarly writings around this that the tribe of Levi was chosen for this kind of priesthood role, priestly role, because of their faithfulness to kind of coming back to God after the golden calf incident with Moses up the mountain, and actually they were the first to say, oh, hang on, we recognize that we've made a mess in Exodus 32. But actually, if you kind of look and dig a bit further, you discover that the priests, the tribe of Levi, were actually designated as priests a little bit earlier, kind of around about chapter 27. So even that is kind of not quite clear. But I think kind of what's essential, and Rox has obviously touched on this, is that these were a people who were set apart, and they were as Rox described, like kind of God was their inheritance rather than the land. And so absolutely it was reinforcing this idea that these were a people who were sustained and upheld by God. And also, kind of this idea, I think, of being set apart is there too. And we talk about, particularly in relation to sacrifices, we talk about animals that were set apart for a specific purpose. The sacrificial lamb, or the firstborn animal, and I think that there's a parallel there of this idea that the tribe of Levi were those that were set apart specifically for this purpose of kind of mediating this relationship between God's people and God. But I think that whole idea of them being a kind of a show home to the rest of the people, God's people, is actually really helpful way of us understanding that they were people who were invited to lead the rest of God's people in a way of living life in engagement with God. And I think, absolutely, it's really helpful to think of, well, what does that mean for us now? And, and whilst we as a priesthood aren't mediating a relationship between, God and humanity, we are a people who kind of offer that invitation, and we are showing what it means to kind of to live that life, and that is our responsibility as our kind of witness in the world, really.
Yeah, great. I love that. Two things really stood out to me. The first is this idea of that their inheritance was God and not land. And I'm like, it just sparked in me that thought of, we're called to be in the world, not of the world. Like, we are called to have our eyes fixed on things that are eternal, that come from God, and not what the world promises, not what you can attain here, but actually can attain heavenly. And I love that. So again, there's that sense of, that there's an invitation to that. Once again, what Jesus offers is better, which has been a reoccurring theme in Hebrews. And then the second thing was that this whole idea of that we are all a priesthood. It was all the tribe of Levi that was welcomed into that inheritance. And so it's not just staff members or people who are in ministry leadership. It's all of us. If you declare that you're a follower of Jesus, then you become a part of that priesthood. And therefore your role in that is to be this example. And so it's really like, it's a call for all of us, not just, the chosen, as sometimes, you can hear that mentality of, no, that's not my role. It's like, well, yeah, actually, yeah, no, it is.
And I think one other thing I would add to that is that, as well, we're all called into this kind of Levitical role, and actually then there's something for us to take very seriously, and the book of Leviticus is kind of connected, and all of. And I love what Rox said about, kind of First Testament, because, whilst we can read things in the Old Testament or the First Testament and feel quite distant from them, like the tribe of Levi were in this role, in this position of mediating relationship between God and humanity, were called to very stringent standards of kind of purity, and I think, whilst Jesus has done the full work of kind of cleansing us, that there is something in there for us to recognize. Actually, God is calling us to a degree of purity, because what we are doing is witnessing this relationship to the world. And so actually diving back into the First Testament and looking at things in Leviticus and thinking, okay, what is being required of me as a follower of Jesus in this kind of Levitical role, now in the 21st century, and what does that mean for how I live out my life? Important challenge for us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Fair to say I feel convicted that I need to spend some time in the Old Testament now. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Well, let's move on to question 2. So, Rox, in this passage that you unpacked for us on Sunday, there was this practice that stood out for me that I guess it raises questions, hence why it's in the big 3. And I think it's something that we don't really talk about that often. It was the mention of the giving of a tenth or a tithe. Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek as a tribute, as a sign of honor to him. And when I first heard that language, I guess the thing that stood out for me now, current context is the whole practice of, weekly offering, the basket going around at church and giving to the ongoing work of the church and its ministries. But I guess what stood out for me is that it's something that we don't discuss openly very regularly. And I'm thinking about particularly our younger listeners who, might be, starting to go into the workforce and think about maybe what does tithing mean in their spiritual practice and in their spiritual journey. And so I wanted to have an opportunity for us to kind of unpack that. And so a number of questions came up for us on Slido around this. And so our question is, how is this idea of giving a tenth or a tithe as a tribute relatable to our modern day offering, or even just our modern day context?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I thought so.
Yeah, really hard question. The hard ones.
Yeah, I know.
Look, I think first thing I want to say is actually back to that Levite question, because as we've already heard, the Levites didn't get that inheritance of land. They their inheritance was the Lord, but they still had to live on something, right? And they still had to feed their children and eat, etc., etc. And so the rest of Israel was commanded to give that tithe, the tenth, the first fruits of their flocks, their fields, anything they had, and to give it to the temple. And that was actually what the Levites would live on. They would use that, so it would be sacrificed to God, but it was also they didn't have land to farm, apart from their little cottage garden. But so that they actually needed that. So there was a responsibility for the rest of Israel to supply that need. And so they were actually called to live, the Levites were actually called to live in reliance upon God in a really significant way. They didn't have any inheritance of land. Their whole life was caught up in just relying on God and his goodness and the obedience of the people. And so they lived on this different frame of just needing God because they couldn't do that for themselves because they were busy being in their mediatory role. So that idea of the tithe is a First Testament, Old Testament idea. But when we transfer it to us in the New Testament, Jesus Jesus doesn't deny the tithe, but he actually goes further. And he goes a bit deeper into that. And I think the best way we can see how Jesus treats this is when we look at the story. There's a story in Mark chapter 12 where he's going past the temple and there's a widow. And we don't know anything about this widow. She could be young with kids. She could be an old lady. We don't know. And she comes along to the temple and she has these 2 copper coins, which were worth, the Bible tells us, only a fraction of a penny. And she throws these into the temple treasury, and that's her offering, that's her gift. And Jesus speaks to his disciples, and he uses her as a bit of an illustration and says, this woman, this widow, has given more than anybody else, more than anybody else. People are coming and they're giving out of their abundance and they're giving their, what the law requires them to do, but she is giving out of her desperation. This is all she has, and yet she's giving it over to God. And he commends her, and we hear about her 2,000 years later for that generous and giving spirit. Not only is she giving to God, but it's also showing a reliance on God that only God can supply her need. Only God can give her what she needs. And so that's probably not a tithe. That's actually an act of sacrifice and an act of generosity and an act of obedience on her behalf. And it's also saying to God, I need you, God. So the idea of a tithe, Jesus actually mixes that up a bit for us. Yeah, absolutely. You hearing where I'm going with that?
Yeah, there's a conviction piece in there as well.
Oh
Classic
gosh.
Jesus.
Oh my gosh, exactly. And so all these people, if you're super wealthy and you're giving 10%, it may be no skin off your nose. You might not even notice it gone, and Jesus kind of puts a challenge on us to say, well, let's give generously. Let's give what we have decided in our hearts to give, the scripture goes on to say. So it's not about a blank 10% that we have to give to God. It's actually, what is God asking you to do out of what God has given you? Because everything you have comes from the Lord, right? There's nothing that God hasn't given you. everything you have comes from God. So what are you going to give back to God? What's God asking you to do? For some people, they could literally tithe or give 90% and be fine.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Some people, to give 10% would send them to bankruptcy court. And so as Christians, we actually have to have a different relationship with the tithe to give stuff to God. A thing that I always remember, because I love my little expressions, it's the only way I remember stuff. but the thing that I've read on a church sign once is give God what's right, not what's left. And you remember it because it's like right hand, left hand. You're getting it? Yeah.
I'm picking up on it. I see.
Okay, but it's give God what is right. You know, what is right for you to give God. Don't give him of your leftovers. Don't give him what's left in your bank balance at the end of the day. Give God first, the first fruits. What you have decided to give out of all that the Lord has given you. And so when we talk about tithes and offerings, you know, that 10% so kind of a baseline. It's not the cap and it's not the ceiling. It's a suggestion. That makes sense.
Just throwing it out there.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think with money, money shows us what we value and what we trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we often talk about, you know, put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
But I think we actually put our money where our heart is. And I think when we decide to say to God, this is yours. Everything I have is yours. What do you want me to give in this space? What am I going to commit to? Then I think that's a whole different conversation, and it actually will help us in our discipleship practice, in our relationship with God, in our trust, like the Levites, in our reliance of God. So it's an opportunity to actually deepen our faith.
Absolutely. And what I love from, go figure, like I knew that this was going to come, like learning from the Old Testament. I knew the second that I said it, I was like, oh, you're setting yourself up.
Yeah, exactly.
But, you know, I love that, you know, we're called to be like the Levites in the sense of we need to trust God and trust that he will provide. But I think there's also an invitation from the perspective of the other 11 tribes, like that it was an act of obedience and devotion to God, that they had a responsibility to see that the tribe of Levi was cared for, and that was an expression of their faithfulness to God. So like it's, no matter where you're sitting, there's a lesson to learn in terms of your spiritual practice when it comes to the tithe. Coleman, what do you have to add in on this?
Well, just kind of diving back into the First Testament as well, and actually, I love that you've picked that up. That idea that it's about kind of being responsible, but it actually was part of covenant practice. So covenant practice said, give the tithe, and that was that was part of being in relationship with God. That was part of being in this covenant with God, was to be obedient to that. And actually, one of the kind of classic passages around this is in Malachi 3 verse 10, again in the First Testament. More stuff for us to learn from there. And it's where the prophet Malachi is charged with speaking to the people of God and say, look, and actually kind of strongly convicting them that you need to bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, because they were withholding parts of that, and the people of God were suffering, like the kind of extended people of God were suffering as a result of it. And it was a call. This particular passage actually talks about God's blessing, goes on to talk about how, you need to do this because you're breaking covenant by not doing it, but also you are also demonstrating your lack of trust in me and the lack of trust in my provision. And God talks about opening the floodgates of his provision as a result of being obedient in that way. And I think that that's a really important kind of message for us. And the reason I think it's important is that we often believe that idols are passive. And I think, when you kind of look at the golden calf, you think, okay, well, it was an inanimate object. The golden calf was an idol, and it's passive. And I believe that we're in danger when we think that idols are passive, because they are activated by the work of the enemy, the work of the devil in our world. And idols have power to draw us away from God because of their kind of insidious subtlety. And actually, what God was inviting the people in Malachi to do is to trust him, but more than that, to not be deceived that their security, and as Rox has talked about, their security could be found in anything else.
Yeah.
And when we choose to give of our first fruits, which is another way of talking about kind of tithing, and and we choose to say, okay, I'm going to set aside a proportion of the money that I've earned, and recognizing that all good gifts come from God, we are more than just supporting the people of God. We are more than just kind of being obedient with covenant relationship, but we're actually taking a stand against the work of the enemy to deceive us in believing that we can secure ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's a really important discipline for us, because spiritual disciplines can feel like, okay, these are the rules and regulations I've got to do because that's what makes me a better Christian. But they are actually the things that bring us freedom, because they are the things that help us move away from the insidious trust of money, which will fail us, which you will never have enough. You will never be able to secure yourself in it. Yeah. And it moves us towards recognizing, do you know what? I have some money and God provides for my needs. And I am able to live in abundance and richness and fullness because I'm released from securing myself in money, but actually I'm securing myself in God's provision and God's desire to give us our daily bread.
Do you know what I was thinking of as you were just speaking then, was this idea of, and I guess this is what you were talking about as well, Rox, where like our heart comes from our heart. Our money comes from our heart, where we use it, in the sense of, because if I'm trusting that God will provide for the things that I need, which draws me closer to him, then actually I think that will also change my perspective of what I need. And I'll stop relying so much on what the world tells me I need to have a fruitful, valuable, worthy life, and actually be more aligned with what God calls the type of life and full life that he promises for me. Whereas if I give my resources, whether that's my money or my time, my attention, my devotion, if I give that to things of the world because I don't trust that God will provide, if I take control of that, then I'm just going to reinforce in my life the messages from the world, from the enemy, that tell me, actually, no, it's these things that you need, not the things of God that won't satisfy. Yeah. And so it's this perpetuating cycle wherever, it really is, wherever you put whatever idol you have in your life, it will determine the type of life that you live, which is outrageously simple, I know, to say, but I don't know, it's an important reminder. And I think, this practice can really help affirm where our devotion is and the type of life that we're going to live.
Oh, treasures in heaven, huh?
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Yeah.
Somebody very famous said that.
Yeah. Good stuff, guys. Thanks for that. That's awesome. Let's move into question 3. So I guess coming back to the passage that you unpacked for us on Sunday, Rox, obviously there's a lot of language and imagery around Jesus and this role of him being the ultimate high priest. And this is something that the author of Hebrews has spent a lot of time reinforcing for us and really making clear that this is a significant role and something that that Jesus offers us, this whole idea of he's our mediator between God, he is our intercessor, that he kind of is the bridge over the gap of us and our Heavenly Father. And what came about in the passage that you preached out of on Sunday was this idea that he's an eternal high priest, that he will always be working in that role, always be interceding for us. And something that stood out for me and definitely came through in the questions from the sermon is, I guess, a bit of a tension, because that idea of Jesus' role kind of being ongoing seems slightly at odds with other descriptions of Jesus' role and what he has done, what he has fulfilled through his death and resurrection. And what I'm talking about is this idea that, Jesus paid the price for sin once and for all, that, the chains of sin have been broken, we've been set free, we've been washed of sin, it no longer has power in our lives. And so that very much feels like a definitive, it's done, lock and loaded, like victory has occurred. And yet that seems kind of to create a tension with this idea that but the role of Jesus is continuing and ongoing as the high priest. And ultimately that is exactly where our final third question lands for us. If we have been totally forgiven and washed clean by the blood of Christ, why do we still need a mediator or an intercessor for all eternity?
Great question.
I've got to admit, when I first read it, I'm like, man, that's a fourth question. Like, that's a special.
That's not the big three. Podcast. That's the big 3,000.
Yeah. But as I tend to do, I'm like, that'll be fun.
Let's put the kids coordinator onto that one.
Yeah, you got this.
Thanks. Am I the Reverend Dr. Mark Rader? No,
that's okay.
That's okay. We'll give it a whirl, hey. Look, I find that it is a big. It's a big question, as we've joked about. We're kind of not there yet in Hebrews as well. So there's a couple of passages that are actually going to address this later on. Like Hebrews 10 talks about this, about what Jesus is doing sort of now, which I find might give us a little bit of light, if that's okay. I might just jump into that. It's actually Hebrews 10, 12 and to 14. And it says, when this priest, Jesus, had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, which is what you've said. And since that time, he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool. For by one sacrifice, he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. Now, you spoke about,
this is the tension.
This is the tension, yeah. Well, made perfect forever. So he has been the sacrifice for the sins. He's been the high priest, the eternal priest in the order of Melchizedek. So he's not even a Levite. He's just beyond that and above that and greater than that. And so he has made us. Perfect. He has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. But Hebrews has a different kind of vibe to the rest of the New Testament, in that it's always talking about us being made perfect, this process of sanctification, that we are sure, like we're saved and we're secure and we've got an eternal future and a destiny and we're, priesthood of all believers, all of that. But we're actually on this process where we are constantly being changed. Even in our talks about, our tithe that we just talked about, how that changes our hearts. We're in this ongoing process. I just want to refer back to something else Mark's talked about, which was the Pilgrim's Progress analogy. This is old story. It's a great old book about how Christian actually receives salvation. He has this giant burden on his back with the burden of sin and shame and guilt, and he lays it down at the cross and he receives salvation. But on the way in the book, he still has to go through all these trials and go through swamps and up mountains, and that's the process that we are undergoing. And so Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God. He's sacrificed, and he is still making us holy through that. And he can do that because he is eternal. He has defeated death. He's not like the Levites who lived and they died and they were replaced, and that one lived and died and that one was replaced, and they had to continually sacrifice the blood of bulls and goats and over again. Jesus is completely above that and other. And he is now sitting at the right hand of God, continually making us holy, and before we stand in front of him. I love this whole this part about since that time he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool, because that's actually the first part of the psalm that we looked at on Sunday. So Psalm 110 is this psalm that Jesus himself quotes. I don't want to re-preach a sermon here.
but I'm gonna.
Exactly. But this is just the best psalm because it talks about, Jesus quotes it. He says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. Yeah. And then it goes on to say you're a high priest, you're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So Jesus actually identifies and says, I'm waiting. I'm waiting till the end of time. We've got work to do, church. I'm alive. I am risen. I have sacrificed. I am sitting at the right hand of God. And while you guys are on the earth and I'm in heaven, I am interceding for you. I am the one who when you come to me with your troubles and your day and your what's been going on in your life, I'm talking to God on your behalf. And I'm still doing that priestly work. I'm making you more perfect, more holy as we go on. Now, when Jesus returns and everything is ended and eternity is wrapped up in a giant bow and and we're with Jesus in glory forever.
Yeah.
The question of, is he still the priest? Is that the question that you're thinking? Because
I don't even know. That just goes even
that
bigger.
Goes really deep because that goes into territory which we would call the Arian controversy, and it talks about the eternal, the way the Trinity works. It's all about is God, superior to Jesus for all time, yada yada. Don't really want to go there.
No,
that's a whole nother
that's
podcast.
scary.
That's terrifying.
That hurts my brain just even thinking about that question.
Right.
So common.
So go to Bible college for that answer.
What are your reflections on this, mate?
Well, just with the Arian controversy, in short, basically about, is it the godliness of Jesus? Essentially, was he fully God? And there's plenty of resources out there if you want to read more about that.
Just ask
and maybe that is a fourth question for us to touch on.
I just want to say, yes, but with a question mark, yes.
But I love what Rox has talked about, and I really agree with that. And essentially at the heart of this question is the process, and I think in some ways it's the process of justification. And the sentence or the phrase, I guess, that I find the most helpful way of thinking about this is that the mediator, Jesus, lives on, but he doesn't go on sacrificing. And the sacrifice is done for all time, all sufficient. It has kind of done what needed to be done in order to remove our sins. And but yet Jesus lives on. And the reason that Jesus lives on is because relationship lives on. Because the sacrifice, it wasn't just a thing that needed to happen, a moment in time, and that's it. And then, the kind of the need for Jesus is eradicated. That's not it. Actually, what the whole purpose of sacrifice is to restore relationship. And relationship carries on, and that is what we're invited into. And so yes, Jesus maintains his high priestly role because he is maintaining a relationship between us and God, and that's a work that is also carried on by the Holy Spirit, and obviously the Holy Spirit was involved in that work between Jesus and God in his time on earth as well. And I think so that idea that the power of Jesus' sacrifice, there's no diminishing of that. It was done in that moment, but actually relationship continues on. But we are also in this kind of continuing process of justification, kind of being declared right before God, and ultimately, the Book of Revelation Chapter 20, verse 12 talks about us coming before another throne, which, and that imagery has already come up for us in the book of Hebrews. Talks about us coming before the white throne and giving account for the things that we have done in our lives that are recorded in another of the books. And so, I still want Jesus there at that moment, actually declaring me righteous before God. And a lot of the Christian faith requires us to hold this tension between the now and the not yet, and the things that have begun but are not yet finished. And I have this weird analogy about time, which I think is actually a helpful way of us thinking about these sorts of things, because we obviously come to the Bible and we come to our understanding of the work of Jesus through a kind of time linear thing. That's something that actually, we're programmed to think about. There's things happening in kind of chronological order and an order of events.
Yeah.
Now, I've got no biblical backing for this. I only offer this as an illustration because...
What a caveat.
I found this to be a helpful way about thinking about God in relation to time. And I imagine time like it's happening in a spiral in the center of a fried egg, in the yolk of a fried egg. And that actually when we move out of time. So when we die, or or the world kind of reaches its end, and we move into that time of judgment, that rather than kind of coming to a point on a line, we actually just pass out into the kind of the white of that fried egg. And so actually time is existing here, and we need it in order for the kind of the world to be in order.
Yeah.
But when we die, or the kind of we reach the day of judgment, the end of the world comes, we move out of that yoke and into the white. And that then allows this concept for those who have died millennia ago, and us dying at whatever point we die, to happen actually kind of at the same time, and we pass out of this yoke and into the white. And actually, so that idea of the kind of all-sufficient sacrifice of Jesus, it kind of happens at the same time for everyone throughout all of history. And we are moving out of the kind of constructs of our earthly time and into the white, which is kind of God's time. And I don't know if that's helpful for you, but that moves, I think, what's helpful and important for us is to kind of crack open, pardon the pun.
I loved that. That was beautifully placed.
I didn't even plan that.
Sure you did.
To crack open our perception of time, and I know, and that's very hard. And I don't want to kind of bend people's brains, but actually seeing God's work outside of time is a really helpful thing for us, because it helps us to understand, God is not constrained by that, and that this work of Jesus is done kind of almost at the same time for everyone, and therefore we don't have this kind of weird tension of, is Jesus going on sacrificing? But actually, no, it's done, and it's done at that moment, and we kind of and it's all sufficient. It's outside of time, and it's not bound by the timeliness of that. Yet it's still deeply significant for our kind of relationship with God, and it's because of his sinless perfection in that, because his he became a priest not because of lineage, but because of his appropriateness for the role, and that he was without sin. That means that this sacrifice is all sufficient for us, and now he mediates the relationship, and that's the kind of ongoing part that we live in, and we explore, and we enjoy.
Wow.
I'm sorry.
My brain hurts. Like,
okay.
let's be real. But I think
time traveling is real. Future Matt's going to come and take it all. Okay.
Gosh, it's all just, my mind's just spinning. But I think like what I'm taking from this as my little nugget is that I think, like, I do think that we do try and simplify and really create a degree of structure around the plan of God, which transcends our understanding and our world. But the invitation remains the same, to trust what the message of Jesus was and what he promised, and the promises of God and what he has done and achieved. And so although we may not be able to, fully grasp the fried egg analogy, which is fine, we can know and trust that Jesus has conquered sin, and that he continues to work and intercede for our benefit with our Heavenly Father to restore our relationship with him. And how and when in time and space that occurs, we may not fully grasp, but we can trust that it is happening, and that it is through his grace and love that it occurs. I'm taking that.
Yeah.
It's good.
It's good. It's good.
For all time. For
all time.
Exactly.
No, let's leave the time. No more time. Guys, thank you so much. Big questions, hard questions, but have loved your reflections on all of them. Thanks so much.
It's been a joy.
If you want to be a part of the conversation, make sure that you join us for our online services this Sunday at gbconline.org.au, and that you snap the Slido QR code before the sermon to get involved. Just a reminder for those of you who are listening to our podcast today, we're also now filming The Big Three, and it goes to air on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. at GBC Online. If you've enjoyed The Big Three today, be sure to give us a star rating and subscribe so that you can stay up to date with all future episodes. Thanks for joining us for this week's Big Three and our deep dive into God's invitation for us all. Remember, there's no thought too small, no question too big.